When I write, I want to write a piece that I'm proud of, and it's a weird sort of balance between, you don't know what you're writing because you're creating something new.
How do you typically start a piece?
How do I start a piece? I try and find something that sparks my interest, and I usually try and develop a piece from nothing. So if it's an idea, it might be a note, 2 notes, 3 notes, 4 notes probably, and play around with it to the point of exhaustion within that sort of initial framework.
Is there a typical way for you to start a piece?
No, there isn't, because it depends on what I'm writing. If I'm writing if I'm writing an opera or a piece of music theatre where lyrics already exist, then I will start off with the words, and the words immediately suggest musical worlds and rhythms.
The beginning of a piece might be very clear to me in my head, and I know exactly how I want to start a piece. Or other times there might be a particular sound world that I would want to explore, whether it's a chord or whether it's something that I know I want this bit to start on, high bass clarinet or whatever it might be. And then that drives the rest of what comes next.
The beginning, in many ways, it feels very chaotic because it's starting from research. So I'll have lots of little bits of research and information all around me. And a sense of the sentiment that I'm trying to create. But all this exists in the head, and I have to sit with a piece of, a blank piece of paper and just wait until the words start to flow in a manner that seems as if it's making sense. And eventually they do.
Wherever you start, you always have to have a point of starting from. It's very difficult to go into a piece with nothing, but some people like to do that. If you improvise, then you can just get your instrument or sit at a piano and work away at that in that sense. But for me, it's very much I have to have a kernel to begin with. Otherwise, it's difficult to proceed.
It's interesting how so many composers, I'm sure probably a lot of non-musicians, sort of other artists and disciplines perhaps would describe it as a state. Like, I think that's a really interesting use of the word, this sort of like state that you get yourself into. Do you find that you need to warm up to create music, or rather warm up to achieve that?
Yeah, not warm up to create music, well, to make music, but definitely that where you're receptive, yeah, you have to wake up to that. Usually it's in the morning anyway, but you definitely have to wake up your consciousness to basically return to dream state, basically, is what one is doing through the music and the repetition, and then going deeper and going back, and then you go, oh yeah, we're back in that zone. And it's all about that. And so the pieces that I write try to capture that kind of energy, but in a static form. That's why I like players that also are not just readers in pieces, because even though I've written the piece and it's notated and it's static, I always need a bit of the spontaneity to make it feel like it's been created in the moment, even though it hasn't, because it's already written. That's why I like, say, Cora with it's slightly different each time, with the composition that's set in stone in a certain way.
It's almost like I have to keep looking back at what's the theme of this movement, this first movement. What is it that I'm trying to say? And sometimes I have to physically get up away from the table and walk away. Sometimes the act of walking helps the thoughts to flow. To flow. And then I'll hear lines, I'll hear sentences, so I'll come back and I'll just start writing. And as I start writing, more will start to come. And then the music starts to sort of draw itself, if you want, in my head. So I'll follow it. I'll follow it on the piano.
I think the best way to keep yourself supple in terms of being ready to compose is to try and do it as often as possible. To sort of, not to say that you'll forget how to compose, but I think it's just to have the creative juices flowing all the time, and when you're ready to sit down and write that piece, you don't have to enter it from the cold. It's almost like going to the gym, you know, or doing some sort of sport activity where you if you do bit by bit every day, you're ready for that bigger thing when it comes.
I've found that once I start writing, I end up getting into that state in any case. The difficulty I find is getting out of that state after, when you have to kind of step out the door and get back into the real world. That's the bit that I find really hard.
I tend to try and balance it out and not write constantly big pieces or constantly small pieces. It's good to have a mix of things. You know, after a big piece, it's nice to go down to a smaller piece, or vice versa. So, you know, writing big pieces back to back can be a bit daunting in the sense that, you know, you feel like you've exhausted all your ideas at that moment in time with the piece that you've just finished. So to go to the next big piece is sort of quite draining on the ideas bank in the head. So yeah, it's good to have some breathing time sometimes between pieces that demand a lot. If I have a lot of time, I might work on manuscript. If I'm at a piano, then I might play around with ideas to see where they lead to. Nowadays, I usually use the piano to check harmonies more and, you know, that sort of stuff. And actually, sometimes, more or less, most of the time, I go straight to shorthand within Sibelius, because, again, the more I work in my own musical language, in my own realm, I know what I'm doing, and you become okay with what you know you're doing.
What role does inspiration play in your composing, and what does it mean to be inspired?
It plays an important role. I guess what inspiration really means is that the moment of writing on any given work is one that is sustained by a desire to complete the piece and a sense of being completely in possession or possessed by. I don't think we're ever in possession of it. There's always something that's eluding us. But you're possessed by this desire to, you know, to seize it, to grasp it, to hold it, to know exactly what it is.
Inspiration, yeah. I think it's just being in that state and drawing that music. It's just tapping into that source. And that's the inspiration. When you get in harmony with that, with the source, that's the moment of inspiration, because it's flowing through. The energy is flowing through naturally.
Well, this is the sort of question that, you know, a lot of non-musicians like to ask: what inspires your music? But I think it's a constant state of being. You look at things and you think, oh, this is interesting. It's almost rather than inspiration, it's more of a curiosity type of thing. You might at any point of a day or a week or a month come across something that interests you, and it takes you down a route that you might want to explore, or you might hear something. You know, recently I heard something on YouTube, which is basically a rhythm, which I'm fascinated by. So obviously I started researching into it, and it will be featured in one of my compositions. So inspiration can come from anywhere. It can come from art, from things that might seem boring. So yeah, it's almost being ready to take that and run with it. You have to. That's what I would take as inspiration. You don't have to sort of look at it in a sort of romantic way. It's could be anything.
Sometimes I used to say with musicians, especially improvising musicians, we're not just tuning the instruments, we're tuning ourselves so that we're in the same state of mind, so that when we're performing, I've had that, say, with the African Classical Music Ensemble, we all stop, start, and we end together. But we haven't organised that ending. But it's almost like a telepathy, because you're in the same state of mind that you know almost what you're going to do before you do it. Again, time, sense of time.
But for me, that is what inspiration is that desire to see it through, to follow it right through to the end, you know. And actually, sometimes you don't want to finish it. You know, it's very difficult. I find the most difficult part of a piece is finishing. There's this conflict where the rational part is saying, time to finish, you know, wrap it up, put the last note in. And there's another part that doesn't want to leave it.
I teach quite a lot of young, composition students, and they're usually kind of under the impression, or they've learned somehow, perhaps a little bit intuitively, they've picked up on this concept that inspiration is something that they have to wait for, that it's something that begins like at the very beginning before they've even started to work, and that they're going to have that eureka moment. And yet with every creative person that I've spoken to, it seems
it's induced. You induce it. You start, you go, and then you start to get to it. It's definitely the worst thing you can do is sit there and wait for, boy, you'll be waiting until the end of time. No, it's the doing. I think I get that because of working in other traditions. Like the Gowan-Webster tradition in Morocco. You know, they start with their thing and it's like, and about 8 hours later, there people are trancing out and doing all kinds of stuff, just completely gone. But it takes that cycling, that cyclic motion to pull out those aspects.
At what point in the process does your music take on a life of its own? Do you think of it as a sort of separate entity? Yeah.
No, it's from the time I start composing. Very quickly I become aware that it's not mine, it's going to be its own person. And then the next stage where it becomes somebody else is when you give it to the performers and it becomes a completely different person.
When you're composing, do you feel as though, well, I know the answer to this question because we've already talked about it, do you feel as though you are its sole creator, assuming you are? Do you feel as though you are finding something that always existed?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's definitely something that's always existed and that we tap into. We actually had a theory at the time when we were, as composers, we were talking about all the ideas, we were also talking about theories, talking about what school we thought we were or were not. And my fellow composer, Paul, he was more of a kind of postmodernist, still within the African sound world, but that kind of approach. But we had something called the Hermetic, I should find these papers actually, it was a theory, it was about our school of composition, and I was more of an African classicist, and he was more of a hermeticist, as it were, composer. And where we met, where we were different in terms of our thinking. But one of the things I remember was we were looking at composition and, the levels of it. And more or less, most of the levels of where we're cognitive, most of the levels before it becomes cognitive, there are so many realms before it reaches us. There are more realms of that than there is this stage. This is like one stage. There are about 6 stages for it to get to us. So from the, if you like, from the conscious realm to the ethereal realm to the this, to the that. And that's why we can say it exists. and that you're trying to tap in to those layers of, if you like, consciousness, but there are different levels of consciousness, and there's one just above where we're at, and then there's others, and it's just trying to bring those concepts and those ideas into the physical or the realm, the material realm, and that's what we do.
I suppose in the moment, in the moment that I'm creating, it's very much a conversation between myself and that work that I'm creating. Once it's finished, and I have the perspective and the distance to look back at it, that's when I will start to see that it's part of something else, you know, and start to see maybe the other family members that are around and where it sits.
Yeah, I can, that sort of idea resonates with me, but I think in a more global sense, it's, again, I don't want to get too cosmic or spiritual, but I think sometimes the things that happen in one's path or journey, it's, you know, there's some very interesting coincidences, and you sort of think, oh, how or why did that happen, or how, you know, why did we meet on, it's interesting that we met at this certain time or this certain point, but in a sort of musical sense, I do think that I'm writing the music. It's I don't let the music lead me in that sense.
So I think I know the music exists if I'm in dream state. I'm not making the music, it's there. So it's just how do we access that? And that's why you try and put yourself in the same state of mind or same consciousness, so that you can receive those things from source. Yeah.
Okay.
But what I would say is, when it's in that realm, you can pull it down as music, you can pull it down as visual art, you could pull it down as dance. It's the same source for the creative, and then it translates through you into what you do. And that's why I find it interesting to work with people from other genres, because we're all tapping into the same source, but then when it comes through us, we channel it differently. And that becomes interesting. How are you channeling this idea in your idiom? How am I channeling it in my own?
But then you can sort of look at it in the point of view that you're attracted to certain things, whether that's harmonies or rhythms or melodies, and you sort of think, why do I like those rather than those? So yeah, there is that. I suppose that's where the sort of traditional idea of composing and creating that sort of magical element, you know, well, how do you pick those ideas, or how do you filtrate those things? Each person has an aesthetic with anything that they do, whether that's how they dress or how they cook or what food they like, or, you know, a multitude of things. So I think I like to be quite practical with how I approach things, and for me, it's just the way I am. It's what makes you an individual, and that's the beauty of composing, and being able to have that language that you've created to sort of play with.
I think sometimes I know that when I'm working on material, I agree with you that it feels as though you're sort of discovering something, and that's often the reason how you know that something is either right or wrong.
Yeah.
But at some stage, I always have the experience of where I really do feel that the music has taken on a life of its own, that there's enough of the cell that's sort of developed and that's grown. And
then it starts to do its own thing, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, because music, once you tap into that thing and you're in you can do it as a live musician, and you're just, you know, everything is just happening, then the natural state of being is when the music shapes itself, and it's almost perfect because it's proportioned by itself. It proportions itself naturally, but you have to be in that frame of mind to be able to do that. And as the composer, you're trying to do the same thing. You're trying to proportion it in the right way so that it's balanced and it hits those points and pulls out that same energy. It's the same thing. So what I experience as a spontaneous musician, creative, and as a composer, it's completely the same thing for me. That's my journey or my path as a composer. I know some people, I don't know, I mean, I can't speak for everyone, but I think there's some composers that kind of very much on the paper, you know, they have their motif and then, you know, they kind of say, oh yeah, and then they do this and they very much organize it. And it's definitely them. And usually I can hear that. What we try and tap into is the eternal, the thing that is beyond ourselves. So it will be here before us and it will be here after us. That's the thing as composer you try to tap into. If you're a composer that creates from yourself only, you're just telling us of your material existence. That's all you can tell us because you're material. If you don't get inspiration from some other fourth level, whatever you want to call it, then you can't give us anything else. And as I said, mostly the composers, well, certainly the composers that inspire me, all of them speak about this in different ways. They all speak about it. Stravinsky was an improviser, so that tells you how he got to his creation. Beethoven was an improviser. Mozart and all those players, but Bach was definitely an improviser. All of them. To be honest, there's not another route really, if we're honest. Only in the 20th century do we really find composers who give us this alternative method. And this alternative method has a beginning and an end. But most of those other composers that we call eternal is because they tap into this thing that's been, it's not just even in Western classical, it's in other traditions, it's across the board. So I guess it's a question of, do you want to tap into the eternal or do you just want to celebrate your own, I don't know, your own human presence, which is valid as well, but it's limited. And that's why I feel in some ways composition, 20th century coming to 21st century, composition that only celebrates us as cognitive beings only is limited if you don't recognize beyond. And you see, if rational deductive, you know, the rational only, if we only accept the rational, what we see, what's material is the only thing that exists, then that will be the limit of the creativity. That's something in any other tradition, whether it's in Africa or in Asia or in South America, any of these traditional cultures, they know that there's more. For creativity, you must tap into the other side of whatever you want to see, however you want to see that. And that's something I believe fundamentally. So in all my creativity, in all my compositions, classical, jazz, hip-hop, could be any genre, that's number one. Number one is that I'm trying to tap into that.